90 days ago, I was drowning, not in water, but in the invisible current of my own thoughts. A relentless stream of worry, self-criticism, and mental exhaustion that had become my normal. Like millions of Americans, I was functional on the outside, meeting deadlines, maintaining relationships, going through the motions of what looked like a successful life. But inside, my mind had become a hostile environment where I spent most of my waking hours. My breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage at work, having just arrived, but unable to make myself get out and walk into the building. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning into increasingly catastrophic scenarios about the day ahead. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but something was different that day. A moment of clarity cut through the anxiety. I suddenly realized I couldn't continue like this. The mental patterns I'd accepted as just how my brain works were destroying my quality of life one day at a time. That moment in the parking garage became the catalyst for what I'm sharing with you today. A 90-day journey of deliberate habit change, focused not on external metrics like weight loss or productivity, but on fundamentally transforming my relationship with my own mind. What happened during these 3 months was more profound than I could have anticipated, with measurable changes, not just in how I feel, but in how my brain actually functions. This isn't a story about magical thinking or overnight transformation. It's about the remarkable neuroplasticity of the human brain and the science of habit formation. How small, consistent changes can create powerful shifts in our neural pathways. Most importantly, it's about how accessible these changes are, even for someone like me who had spent years believing my anxious, overwhelmed mind was simply my permanent reality. Let me take you back to day one, when I decided to approach this challenge systematically. As a researcher by profession, I knew that wishful thinking wouldn't be enough. I needed a framework based on neuroscience and behavioral psychology. After consulting studies from institutions like Stanford's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, Harvard's Department of Psychology, and the University of Wisconsin's Center for Healthy Minds, I identified 5 key habit areas with the strongest evidence for cognitive and emotional impact: attention training through daily mindfulness practice, cognitive restructuring via journaling, physical movement specifically for neurochemical optimizing, sleep hygiene overhaul digital, consumption redesign. The research was clear. These 5 areas represented the highest leverage points for mental well-being, with cascading effects across all aspects of cognitive and emotional functioning. But knowing what to change is the easy part. The question was how to actually implement these changes in a sustainable way, especially when my mind was already overtaxed. This is where James Clear's Atomic Habits framework became my roadmap. Instead of attempting dramatic lifestyle overhauls, I would focus on tiny, manageable changes, what Clear calls 1% improvements, implemented with strategic precision. For each of the 5 habit areas, I designed a micro-habit that required less than 5 minutes and attached it to an existing routine, creating what behavioral scientists call a habit stack. My initial protocol looked like this. After pouring my morning coffee, existing habit, I would sit for 2 minutes of mindful breathing, new micro-habit. After brushing my teeth at night, existing habit, I would write 3 sentences in my journal addressing one thought pattern from the day, new micro-habit. After removing my shoes when getting home, existing habit, I would do 60 seconds of movement that raised my heart rate, new micro-habit. After getting into bed, existing habit, I would do a 90-second body scan relaxation, new micro-habit. After unlocking my phone each morning, existing habit, I would look at a nature image for 10 seconds before checking any apps, new micro-habit. Each of these micro-habits was deliberately designed to be almost ridiculously achievable, so small that it would be harder to make an excuse than to just do it. This is what BJ Fogg from Stanford's Behavior Design Lab calls the tiny habits approach, and it's especially crucial when willpower is already depleted by mental health challenges. To establish a baseline, I documented my starting point through both subjective and objective measures. Subjectively, I tracked daily mood, anxiety levels, and mental energy using validated psychological scales. Objectively, I used a wearable device to monitor heart rate variability, a key indicator of stress resilience, sleep quality metrics, and activity levels. I also took standardized cognitive tests measuring attention control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, executive functions that research shows are heavily impacted by chronic stress and anxiety. The first 2 weeks were unremarkable, which is exactly what the science predicted. Habit formation research shows that the early days of behavior change occur before any noticeable benefits, requiring us to persist through what psychologists call the valley of disappointment. I felt awkward doing my new micro-habits, often forgetting them or performing them mechanically. The anxious, critical voices in my head were still dominant, occasionally mocking my efforts as pointless. But around day 17, something subtle began to shift. I noticed a moment of pause between a stressful trigger, an unexpected email from my boss, and my habitual spiral of catastrophic thinking. It wasn't that the anxious thoughts didn't come, they did, but for perhaps 2 seconds, there was space between the trigger and my reaction. This tiny gap might seem insignificant, but from a neuroscience perspective, it represented the beginning of what Dr. Viktor Frankl famously called the space between stimulus and response, the essence of cognitive freedom. By day 30, these small shifts were becoming more frequent. My morning mindfulness practice had gradually extended from 2 minutes to 8, not because I forced it, but because the experience itself became rewarding enough that I naturally wanted more of it. My journaling expanded from 3 sentences to a full page, as I discovered the clarifying power of externalizing thought patterns that had previously circled endlessly in my mind. The objective metrics were beginning to show changes too. My heart rate variability had increased by 14%, indicating improved autonomic nervous system regulation. My sleep efficiency had improved from 76% to 82%, reflecting deeper and more restorative rest patterns. But perhaps most importantly, my scores on tests of attention control had improved by 19%. I was becoming measurably better at directing and sustaining my focus where I chose, rather than where my anxious mind pulled it. Emboldened by these early results, I carefully expanded my protocol for the second month. The key was maintaining the success-oriented approach of tiny, manageable steps, while gradually increasing the challenge. For each of my 5 habit areas, I added one small enhancement. I incorporated a brief body scan at the beginning of my mindfulness practice. I added a self-compassion element to my journaling, deliberately using kind language toward myself. I extended my movement microhabit to include 60 seconds of strength exercise. After the cardiovascular burst, I removed electronic devices from my bedroom, using a traditional alarm clock. Instead, I established a digital sundown practice, turning off notifications 1 hour before bedtime. These adjustments were guided by findings from specific studies. For example, research from Dr. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas shows that self-compassion practices activate different neural pathways than self-criticism, significantly reducing the inflammatory stress response that contributes to anxiety and depression. Similarly, studies from Dr. Matthew Walker's sleep laboratory at UC Berkeley demonstrate that even brief exposure to blue light from devices before sleep disrupts melatonin production for hours afterward. Dr. Kelly McGonigal, a health psychologist at Stanford, explains why this gradual approach is so effective. When we make tiny changes and experience success, we're not just building habits, we're building identity. Each small win reinforces a new self-narrative about who we are and what we're capable of, which has profound effects on motivation and resilience. This identity shift became apparent around day 45 when I noticed myself spontaneously making choices aligned with mental well-being without having to consciously decide. When faced with free time, I found myself drawn to a walk outside rather than mindless scrolling. When experiencing stress, my instinct shifted toward taking a few conscious breaths, rather than immediately reaching for distraction. These weren't dramatic transformations, but subtle redirections of my automatic responses, evidence that my neural pathways were indeed beginning to rewire. The brain scan research from Dr. Richard Davidson's lab at Wisconsin explains what was happening physiologically. When we repeatedly engage in particular thought patterns or behaviors, we strengthen specific neural circuits through a process called experience-dependent neuroplasticity. Over time, these strengthened pathways become the path of least resistance for neural firing, our default mode. My consistent micro-habits were literally carving new trenches for my thoughts to flow through, making it progressively easier for my brain to access regulated, centered states. By the 60-day mark, objective measurements showed compelling changes. My resting heart rate had decreased by 7 beats per minute. My heart rate variability had increased by a total of 23% from baseline. My sleep quality score had improved to 89% efficiency, with notably more time spent in deep and REM sleep phases essential for cognitive function and emotional processing. Most remarkably, my scores on standardized tests of cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt thinking and attention between concepts or tasks, had improved by 31%, suggesting significant enhancements in prefrontal cortex function. But perhaps the most meaningful shift was in my subjective experience of daily life. The relentless internal critic that had provided running commentary on my inadequacies for as long as I could remember had not disappeared, but its volume had diminished considerably. In its place was growing a voice of reasonable perspective, one that could acknowledge challenges without catastrophizing, recognize my efforts without demanding perfection, and relate to my mistakes with curiosity rather than condemnation. Entering the final month of my experiment, I focused on deepening and integrating these practices. The foundation was solid, but I wanted to understand how these habits could function not just as daily practices, but as tools for navigating life's inevitable challenges. After all, the true measure of mental resilience isn't how we function when everything is going well, but how we respond when faced with stress, setbacks, and unexpected difficulties. As if on cue, life provided plenty of opportunities to test this resilience. During the third month, I faced a significant project failure at work, an unexpected health scare with my mother, and the ordinary accumulation of daily stressors that previously would have sent me into a prolonged anxiety spiral. While these situations were still difficult, and I certainly experienced appropriate concern and emotional responses, the quality of my relationship to these experiences was fundamentally different. Dr. Daniel Siegel, clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine, describes this shift as moving from reaction to response. 4. In his research on interpersonal neurobiology, he explains that our habitual reactions to stress are largely governed by implicit memory systems that operate outside conscious awareness. These automated patterns, often formed in early life, create what he calls neural ruts that our thoughts travel down with increasing momentum during times of stress. What my 90 days of habit change had accomplished was not eliminating stress or difficult emotions, but creating alternative neural pathways, what Dr. Siegel calls the high road of prefrontal cortex processing, that allowed me to experience these situations without being completely hijacked by them. The space between stimulus and response that had begun as a momentary gap had expanded into a genuine capacity for choice about how to relate to my experience. The shift became particularly evident during what would normally have been a triggering work situation. In a meeting with senior leadership, my presentation was interrupted with unexpected criticism. Previously, the scenario would have activated an intense shame response, triggering physical symptoms, racing heart, constricted breathing, and cognitive distortions. Everyone thinks I'm incompetent, my career is over. The emotional aftermath would have lasted for days. This time, while I still felt the initial wave of embarrassment and anxiety, I noticed it as a sensation rather than being immediately consumed by it. My breathing practice had trained me to recognize when my breath shortened and to intentionally extend my exhales, a simple technique that activates the parasympathetic nervous system. The cognitive restructuring work from my journaling practice enabled me to internally observe the catastrophic thoughts without accepting them as reality. Most importantly, the self-compassion element reminded me that moments of professional challenge are universal human experiences, not evidence of personal deficiency. The result wasn't that I felt perfectly comfortable, I didn't, but I was able to stay present, respond thoughtfully to the feedback, and move forward without the situation dominating my mental landscape for days afterward. My recovery time from emotional triggers had dramatically decreased, allowing me to use that reclaimed mental energy for more constructive purposes. This accelerated emotional recovery represents what neuroscientists call improved vagal tone, the functional efficiency of the vagus nerve, which coordinates our parasympathetic, rest and digest nervous system. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains that consistent practices like mindful breathing, progressive relaxation, and even certain forms of movement strengthen the vagal brake, allowing us to more quickly downregulate after stress activation. My heart rate variability measurements, which had continued to improve throughout the third month, were the physiological confirmation of this enhanced nervous system flexibility. As I approached the final weeks of my 90-day experiment, I made one additional refinement to my protocol. Research from positive psychology pioneers like Dr. Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina suggests that intentionally cultivating positive emotional states, not as an avoidance of difficult emotions, but as an active practice of resourcefulness, builds psychological capital that supports resilience. Her broaden and build theory demonstrates that positive emotions don't just feel good, they measurably expand our cognitive capabilities and behavioral repertoires. With this research in mind, I added a simple gratitude practice to my morning routine, taking 60 seconds to identify 3 specific elements of my life that I genuinely appreciated. Importantly, I focused not just on naming these elements, but on actually experiencing the feeling of appreciation and what neuropsychologist Rick Hanson calls taking in the good, by savoring positive experiences long enough for them to be encoded into implicit memory. The cumulative effect of these practices became evident in my final assessments at day 90. My standardized tests of attention control showed a 34% improvement from baseline. Cognitive flexibility scores had increased by 29%, and working memory function improved by 21%. These cognitive enhancements translated directly to real-world functioning. I found myself more present in conversations, more efficient with complex tasks, and notably less mentally fatigued at the end of workdays. The physiological markers were equally compelling. My heart rate variability had increased by a total of 37% from baseline, placing me in the excellent category for my age group. My sleep efficiency consistently remained above 90%, with an average of 38 more minutes of quality sleep per night compared to my pre-experiment baseline. Perhaps, most surprisingly, my average daily step count had increased by over 4,000 steps without any specific focus on exercise, simply a result of having more energy and less resistance to physical movement. But the most profound transformation wasn't captured in any measurement. It was the qualitative shift in how it felt to live in my own mind. The relentless self-criticism that had been my constant companion for decades had been replaced by a more balanced inner dialogue. The hypervigilance for potential threats or failures had softened into a more grounded awareness. Most importantly, the sense that my thoughts were happening to me, an experience of being perpetually ambushed by my own mind, had evolved into a capacity to witness thoughts as mental events rather than absolute truths. Dr. Judson Brewer, Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, explains this shift in terms of reward-based learning. Our brains continue to produce habitual thoughts and emotions that were reinforced in the past, he notes, but with consistent practice, we can actually update the reward value of these patterns. We can train ourselves to find more reward in clarity and presence than in rumination and worry. This doesn't mean I no longer experience anxiety, self-doubt, or mental fatigue. I absolutely do. The difference is that these states no longer define my entire experience or dictate my behavior to the same degree. They've become weather patterns, moving through the larger sky of awareness, rather than the entirety of the atmosphere. For those interested in incorporating elements of this approach into their own lives, I want to emphasize that the power was in the strategic systematicity rather than heroic effort. I didn't spend hours in meditation retreats or undergo radical lifestyle changes. The entire protocol averaged less than 30 minutes total per day, deliberately integrated into existing routines to minimize friction. The key components that research suggests made the difference were consistency over intensity, small daily practices rather than occasional major efforts, habit stacking, attaching new behaviors to established routines, starting with ridiculously achievable micro-habits to build momentum, using both subjective and objective feedback to maintain motivation, gradually expanding practices as they became more automatic, incorporating all 5 key domains rather than focusing on just one approach. Dr. B.J. Fogg from Stanford emphasizes the importance of this balanced approach. Most people overestimate what they can accomplish with a burst of motivation, and vastly underestimate what they can accomplish with tiny changes repeated over time. My experience powerfully confirmed this principle. The 90-day transformation wasn't the result of any single dramatic change, but the accumulated effect of approximately 1,800 tiny positive decisions compounded over time. The implications of this experiment extend far beyond my individual experience. We're living in what many mental health professionals are calling a psychological crisis, with anxiety, depression, and burnout reaching unprecedented levels across American society. Standard advice to seek therapy or practice self-care often feels inadequate against the scale of these challenges, especially given barriers of cost, access, and time constraints. What my journey suggests, supported by an emerging body of research, is that significant improvements in mental well-being are accessible through strategic habit change, guided by neuroscience principles. These approaches don't replace professional treatment when needed, but they offer a powerful complementary pathway that puts some agency back in our own hands. As neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman of Stanford University School of Medicine puts it, the science is clear that we can leverage neuroplasticity through specific behavioral practices. The brain is constantly being shaped by experience, and we have more control over those experiences than many people realize. Wasets. If you're inspired to undertake your own version of this experiment, I encourage you to begin exactly where I did, with habits so small they seem almost trivial, but implemented with absolute consistency. 2 minutes of mindful breathing, 3 sentences of journaling, 60 seconds of movement. These micro-habits might seem insignificant against the scale of mental health challenges, but their cumulative impact can literally reshape your neural architecture over time. Remember that the goal isn't to achieve some idealized state of perpetual calm or happiness. The human mind will always generate difficult thoughts and emotions. That's part of its evolutionary design. The goal is to develop a different relationship with these mental experiences, one characterized by more space, more choice, and more flexibility in how we respond. What would your life look like with 30% more mental clarity? With significantly improved sleep quality? With an enhanced ability to recover from emotional triggers? These aren't theoretical questions. They're practical possibilities, supported by both emerging neuroscience and ancient wisdom traditions. The 90-day framework offers a reasonable time frame to experience meaningful change while maintaining realistic expectations. I'd love to hear about your experiences if you decide to implement any elements of this approach. What micro-habits would make the most sense for your specific challenges? What existing routines could you build upon? How might you measure progress in ways that are meaningful to you? Remember that this journey isn't about perfection, it's about progression. My 90 days included plenty of missed practices, resistance, and setbacks. What mattered wasn't flawless execution, but the consistent return to intention. As meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg wisely notes, the healing is in the return, not in never having wandered to begin with. If you found value in this account of my experience, please consider subscribing to this channel for more evidence-based approaches to psychological well-being. In future videos, I'll be diving deeper into each of the 5 key habit areas, sharing specific protocols, troubleshooting common challenges, and exploring the latest research on neuroplasticity and mental health. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of what's possible when we approach the mind not as a fixed entity, but as a responsive system capable of remarkable change. The journey continues beyond these 90 days, but with a fundamentally different understanding of what it means to inhabit a human mind, not as passive recipients of our thought patterns, but as active participants in shaping our inner landscape.